Elders, chiefs, my fellow Anishinaabe, Ani Bojo, Wajgesh Nido Kwe Dijnakazin, Makwado Dem, Chiging Donjaba. Congratulations on another Treaty Week program. I have no doubt it will be a success. Through the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850 Annuities case, we have seen the need for restoring balance in the treaty relationship between the First Nations and the Crown. The treaty law principles I want to focus on today is the Anishinaabe perspective. Ontario purports not to challenge the trial judge's findings about the Anishinaabe perspective and the history of the Crown-Anishinaabe relationship. They seem to have little to say about this. Ontario asked the Ontario Court of Appeal and now the Supreme Court of Canada to adopt an interpretation of the treaty that is not only inconsistent with the Anishinaabe perspective, but entirely ignorant and dismissive of it. From what we see and hear from Ontario submissions to date, it sounds like Ontario is suggesting that both the Anishinaabe and the Crown in 1850 thought that paying $1.60 with a possible upper limit of only $4 for complete and unfettered access to Anishinaabe Aking was perfectly acceptable, no matter how valuable that territory turned out to be. Because the Anishinaabe could not have expected to be treated as equal partners by the Crown, worthy of respect and worthy of a fair share of the wealth produced from their own territory. The Supreme Court of Canada told us in Mikisew that to give effect to reconciliation in the interpretation of treaties, it is critical to give equal weight to the perspective of the Indigenous treaty partner, not just the Crown. By ignoring the historical context of that treaty relationship and Anishinaabe perspective, Ontario's position does not serve reconciliation at all. The trial judge and the Ontario Court of Appeal took seriously the duty to learn about the Anishinaabe perspective. The trial judge heard over 60 hours of testimony from chiefs, elders, and experts. She sets out in her decision many findings about Anishinaabe perspectives, such as the qualities of leadership and the metaphorical discourse with relations, protocols of diplomacy, and principles of treaty alliance. She found these Anishinaabe perspectives and practices would have informed what the Anishinaabe leaders intended at the Treaty Council of 1850 and how they would have understood their agreement with the Crown. I will now review some of these important findings for you. The trial judge found that the relationships were central to the Anishinaabe worldview. She found, quote, from Anishinaabe perspective, the central goal of the treaty was to renew their relationship with the Crown, which was grounded in the Covenant Chain Alliance and visually represented on wampum belts with images of two figures holding hands as part of two links in a chain. To a great extent, the Crowns agreed with this proposition, end quote. The trial judge found that agreements to share territory were made around council fires, which were hosted by Ogama. At paragraphs 27 to 30, the trial judge found that Ogama had to demonstrate a record of accomplishment in other roles first, perhaps as a warrior or a hunter, therefore meeting the tests of being a good provider or exhibiting an ability to protect their people. Ogama were expected to be generous. Good leaders would accumulate wealth in order to give it away. Generosity, care for the land and others, and commitment to provide for one's people were foundational to the political authority. Ogama did not assert authority over something or someone, but embodied principles of responsibility to and respect for the autonomy of others, as demonstrated through deliberative and consensus-based processes. Ogama are bound by laws and their obligations to the people. Ogama could negotiate the shared use of lands and resources, but they could not violate Anishinaabe law. Dr. Bohacker explained that the Anishinaabe in 1850 would have understood the augmentation clause as a treaty obligation, and that they would have expected the Crown or the Queen or Chigimakwe to fulfill the treaty obligation in a manner consistent with the qualities and expectations embedded within that kinship and leadership title. It is for this reason that the trial judge found that the concept of discretion, as Ontario uses that term to mean an unfettered and unreviewable discretion, could not have formed part of the common intention of the Robinson-Huron Treaty parties. Given that the trial judge's findings about the Anishinaabe perspective on leadership and principles of treaty making, it would not have been possible for the Anishinaabe to intend that decisions about increases to the annuity, whether explained or translated as mandatory or discretionary, would be entirely unbounded from principles like generosity, fairness, reciprocity, and mutual responsibility. Such an understanding was impossible because from an Anishinaabe perspective, treaty commitments were by their nature commitments of mutual care. The Anishinaabe would not have conceived of a treaty obligation to decide whether to increase the annuity beyond $4 could be made without regard to the interests and needs, to their interests and needs, The trial judge found at paragraph 423, and I quote, "These principles of respect, responsibility, reciprocity, and renewal were foundational to the Anishinaabes' understanding of relationships. For the Anishinaabe, the treaties were not a contract and were not transactional. They were the means by which the Anishinaabe would continue to live in harmony with the newcomers and maintain relationships in unforeseeable and evolving circumstances." The trial judge made several findings about the Anishinaabe relationship to Anishinaabe Aki. The Anishinaabe connection to and relationship with Anishinaabe Aki was and is central to their worldview. The trial judge recognized this, stating at paragraphs 56 to 60, and I quote, "When the Anishinaabe speak of creation, they recognize that they were brought into a complex web of relationships operating across the land." And at paragraph 60, quote, "As the last placed within creation, the Anishinaabe could not act in ways that would violate those relationships that came before their placement on the land and that were already in existence across creation," end quote. The Anishinaabe relationship with the land is the bedrock of their society. Two of the organizing principles of Anishinaabe laws and systems of governance are learned from Fred Kelly at paragraph 21. Pamatswin, life, where everything is alive and everything is sacred. And Gejewadzawin, the way of the Creator, which encompasses the 7 grandfather teachings or 7 sacred laws of creation. And Anishinaabe understood themselves as merely one part of creation, deeply connected to and interdependent on the larger collectivity of other beings. Anishinaabe engaged with the creation in meaningful ways that nourish and balance them physically and spiritually. The Anishinaabe have always been open to new aspects of the deeply interdependent world and relationship with Anishinaabe Aki. But they could not have agreed to a treaty that would sever their relationship to the land or compromise their ability to continue being sustained from that relationship with Anishinaabe Aki. Apart from the established protocols for sharing territories, Anishinaabe were exceedingly strict with regard to unauthorized intrusion into their territories. Through treaties, Anishinaabe did not give up their relationship to the land, but extended and shared it with the Crown. Anishinaabe understood treaties as living relationships, sacred agreements that bring newcomers into our existing relationship with Anishinaabe Aki and all of creation. Newcomers are incorporated into existing web of relationships through kinship metaphors. Kinship metaphors entailed obligations of mutual care and responsibility, much like kin relationships as conceived from a Euro-Canadian perspective. At paragraph 47, the trial judge found, and I quote, "In 1850, kinship metaphors were still very much relevant and defined the expectations, perspectives, and understandings of both the Crown and the Anishinaabe in respect of the making, interpretation, and implementation of the Robinson Treaties. In the context of the negotiations of the Robinson Treaties, the use of kinship terms served as diplomatic formality, which was not, however, divorced from the underlying metaphors that accompanied kinship terms. Although the Crown and the Anishinaabe came to the negotiation table from different worldviews, there was a reciprocal use and understanding of kinship metaphors." End quote. At trial and the Ontario Court of Appeal, we discussed events leading up to the Treaty of Niagara in 1764. Another key component of the historical context that the trial judge made findings about was the historical relationship between the Crown and the Anishinaabe. Crown actors like Treaty Commissioner Robinson understood that the Anishinaabe saw treaty relationships as establishing responsibilities to provide mutual care as kin. The Crown performed the role of treaty partner and invoked metaphors and language that the Anishinaabe would have understood, as the Crown accepting its responsibility to deal with them as kin. For example, the Treaty Council was conducted at the Anishinaabe Council Fire under the Anishinaabe system of law and governance, respecting their ceremonies and protocols and in their language. This demonstrated to the Anishinaabe that Crown continued to respect and acknowledge their laws and autonomy. Second, Robinson gave out pounds of tobacco and distributed many gifts, including kettles, medals, and food. In the context of the treaty relationship between the Anishinaabe and the Crown, those items have an important symbolic significance. This demonstrated to the Anishinaabe that the Crown continued to acknowledge its obligations and responsibilities to take care of their treaty partner. Third, even up to the time of the Treaty Council, the Crown continued to acknowledge the military assistance provided by the Anishinaabe. At paragraph 95 of her reasons, the trial judge found, in September of 1849, for example, Indian Superintendent Thomas G. Anderson presented Chief Shingwakos and Chief Tagawini with medals for their services in the War of 1812. I note again the presentation of medals took place during the Vidal-Anderson Commission, whose report was instrumental in the treaty. It was also just weeks before the affair at Mica Bay, which was also a critical turning point that pushed the Crown to make the treaty. And further, I note that it was Chief Shingwakos and Chief Tagawinene that the recipients of medals who also gave speeches to the Governor General at the opening of the Treaty Council of 1850, which, by Robinson's own diary account, was marked with military pomp and circumstance, including declarations of attachment to the Queen. The trial judge heard extensive evidence like this and made key findings about the Anishinaabe perspective and about how the representatives of the Crown, from Sir William Johnson to William Benjamin Robinson, demonstrated their understanding of the Anishinaabe perspective through their actions for nearly a century. Findings like these are part of what supports the trial judge's finding at paragraph 214 of her reasons, where she states, the location of the Treaty Council, as well as the protocols and procedures followed, indicate that the British, including Robinson, had developed at least a functional understanding of the Anishinaabe systems of law, diplomacy, and language. The trial judge found that Crown representatives and Anishinaabe leaders developed a mutually understood diplomatic discourse that they used in decades prior to the Robinson treaties. This discourse included symbols, metaphors, ceremonies, and items of material culture. Through the alliance relationship, the British developed understandings of Anishinaabe protocols and traditions sufficiently to incorporate them into their diplomatic exchanges. The undisputed facts that the Anishinaabe and the Crown were still acknowledging the Covenant Chain Alliance and treating each other with mutual respect in 1850. I could go on and on. However, despite the acknowledgement and understanding of the Anishinaabe perspective from the Ontario Superior Court, Justice Hennessy, the trial judge, and the Ontario Court of Appeal, Ontario completely ignores the Anishinaabe perspective. In fact, they now, in written submissions at the Supreme Court of Canada, continue to ignore the Anishinaabe perspective. The only reference to the Anishinaabe oral history at the Court of Appeal was from an affidavit of Mashakayash. And in Supreme Court of Canada, written submission is from Elder Rita Corbiere, but they misunderstood her evidence. We say we had oral history from Elder Stevens and Elder Mekadeben at trial. Their evidence followed an elder's protocol that was developed to receive elder evidence in a respectful way to accommodate the Anishinaabe perspective. Chiefs of the communities were invited to take the stand to attest to the credentials of the elders and to their authority and acceptance as elders. This is in accordance with Anishinaabe ways and in accordance with the admission of elder testimony in common law courts. The elders' protocol, which was adopted by an order of the court, to our knowledge, is a first in a provincial superior court in Canada. I want to show you some examples of how we use the Anishinaabe perspective at the trial court. The trial court and the Court of Appeal hearings are still archived and can be watched. So please feel free when you have time, to go and watch more of this testimony. So, as required by the Elders Protocol, Chief Sayers of Batchewana gave evidence about Anishinaabe perspective and the importance of Elder Stevens. Let's have a listen to some of that evidence now. I want you to inform the court that you had, before becoming chief, been told to work with 13 elders. Is Irene Stevens one of the 13 elders that you work with?
Yes, Irene is one.
And what are, you described about the special characteristics of elders. Can you tell us a bit about why Irene Stevens is such an important elder?
For us, and as soon as I became chief, the people continually reminded me that you got to make sure you incorporate Irene into work that you do, because Irene has the true, pure, historical memory of our people's relationship and our cultural teachings. She didn't pick it up in the 60s or 70s. She was born with it. She grew up with it. It's who she is. Her cultural understandings, her historical understandings. her dad was chief quite a ways back as well, and she just has had the opportunity to witness and see so much of our Indigenous worldview through time. She has the ability to share that, and she has no problem sharing her understandings with leadership today, and reminds us of things that we shouldn't forget in the work that we do. One of the first things that she told me, she says, "That's not the treaty." She said, "Where's fire? Where's sweetgrass? Where's Sama? Sama's supposed to be in that." And I was saying, how could that be in there? But it's the spiritual concept that she understood, that there was supposed to be this incorporation into that document of our spiritual perspective, and how that those spirits came to help us with that, and we're not doing that anymore with the honoring of the spiritual side of the way the treaty was supposed to look. So she's really dear to me, and I believe she's really dear to our people as far as the wisdom and the knowledge that she carries, as far as her historical knowledge is concerned, her spiritual knowledge, cultural knowledge, her language.
Do you have an example that you want to share with the court about a time when Elder Stevens shared some of that knowledge with your people of Batchewana?
Yeah. When you go from Gouli Mission, you go to the west end of Sault Ste. Marie, and you go to where Lake Superior opens up. And a couple of bays down on the northeast shore of Lake Superior is Gouli Mission, or Gouli Bay. And they call that Chuaquadam. But when there was no highways, and there was just trails, the elders and the people would use Lake Superior as the highway. So whenever they'd come to Sault Ste. Marie to trade and to do things, they would use Lake Superior as the highway. And they would, out at Red Rock, out near Grocap, there was a place there. So when they would come to Baoting, they would come in and trade their baskets, and they'd trade their rugs, and they'd trade their berries. They would come to Baoting. And what she reminded me of, what she told me, was that they'd head back to Gouli afterwards. And when they got to this place over there, they call it Bakiwa Kong Namoye, where the frog woman sits. And it's right at Red Rock, they call it now. But right there is it would be the south end of Gouli Mission, Gouli Bay. And if it was really windy, they wouldn't be able to cross the bay in their boats. So she said that this rock formation was maybe 100 meters off the shore of Gouli Bay, the south side. And she remembers the old ladies going out there, hiking up their skirts and walking out into the water about 100 meters. And there was this rock formation of a frog woman with her legs crossed, and in her lap was a natural bowl, a natural rock formation. And that rock formation was in like that, in the formation of a bowl, in the shape of a bowl. And that's where the elders would put Sama into that bowl. And as soon as they put tobacco or Sama into that bowl, the water would calm down. And then she remembers saying, "Hurry up, everybody get in the boats." And that's what she would tell us. And they'd all run back to their boats and get into the boats and get in, and then they'd cross Gouli Bay. And when they get to the other side, the winds would pick back up. And so maybe 15 years ago, we decided we're going to go look for this rock formation. We're going to find Frog Woman. And Frog Woman is nowhere to be found. We took our canoes up and down the coast there where she said it would be, where it was at the time, and we couldn't find it. We went up and down, up and down. And then she said, "See, That's because we're not using Sema. And she says, you know what happens? She says, when we need something and we ask the spirits for something, the spirits will give us what we need. And if we don't use it anymore, they go back to the spirit world. She said, so that spirit that was presented and was needed by the people at that time came and worked for the people at that time. And there was feasts and there was Sema and there was things that were used to have that spirit work for us and be here. But over time, we no longer fed that spirit. We no longer put Sema down anymore. We didn't have feasts. So that spirit went back. And that spirit isn't there anymore. You ain't going to find that spirit, because she thought maybe it might have been there, but it wasn't there anymore because we didn't ask or didn't take care of it and look after it. So, but if whatever we need, she would tell us, and we pray and we put our Sema down, we'll get whatever we need today. So those are the kinds of stories that she would tell us about the different places, the different spirits on the land in the area, in Lake Superior, wherever. Those are Badranung stories, our Lake Superior and Anishinaabe stories, and stories of how we relate on the land. And she has that kind of old story. You ain't going to read that in the book. That's stuff that she learned, growing up from the people on the water, on the land, with their fishery.
You also mentioned that some of the people have just learned it. Was she able to show you how to do something with the spirits, your community?
Like, I'm not sure what you mean.
About, for example, did she show your community how to feed the water spirits?
Oh yeah. Yeah, so when we went to another harbor, another bay, and there was a couple hundred of us, and again, the elder said, we can't just go in. We can't just go on the land without putting our Sema down and explaining what we're doing. And if any harm comes to any animals or any shrubs or any flora, any plants, that we need to apologize. We're not intentionally doing that, but we're doing our work, and how we have to apologize for the interference. So we'd have to put our Sema down, and we'd have to smoke our pipes. We'd have to have ceremony before we went in. And we had to have a feast. So she said, we're going to have this feast, and today we're going to feed Mijo Bajon. We're going to feed that spirit of Lake Superior. So a couple hundred of us, we all smoked our pipes, and we had a lot of elders there. And she told the women, and she told all of us how to do the feast, how to food ready, and what we had to do, and how we had to do that, how it had to be cooked and stuff. And then we went down to the water. She says, come on everybody, come on down to the water. And we're going to go down to the water. And she went right to the edge of the water. And she started to, and we had to bring that plate. We had to bring a plate with the food down to the water. And she held that plate. And she said her prayer. And then she leaned over and she brushed that plate off into Lake Superior. And where we were was in this bay, maybe a kilometer across. And it was kind of like a gravelly beach, gravel like that size. And you could see just on the beach there. And then maybe about 30 feet away, you could see where there was a drop off. There was a gradual slope on the beach under the water, maybe 20, 30 feet gradually, and then it went on a drop. So she put this plate of food in the water for Mijo Bajo, and then never thought anything of it. And then you could see it was really calm day. The lake was calm, and you could see about 50 feet away. You could see this little ripple in the lake, a little bit of a little wave coming in. This little wave started to make its way in, and gradually got closer and closer, and it kind of broke water a little bit. And then when it got to the shore, it went under the water, and you could see that food just being dragged down in water, and dragged down and the 20 or 30 feet, and dragged down and went over the edge. The food went over the edge. And she said, see? That's what we got to do. That's Mijo Bajo. We got to feed that spirit. but a powerful moment.
I also want to hear a little from Elder Stevens of Batchewana. So for her, we will demonstrate how the protocol introduced her very differently than any other case before. We had her sit beside the lawyer and the interpreter, and you'll see the interpreter even has her hand on the shoulder of the elder. There's just so much respect that was given and afforded Elder Stevens. Then you will hear some of her testimony about what was required by the augmentation clause and the need for there to be more than $4 as a treaty obligation. And we will show you a little ending about how she talked and how respected, and I mean, there was even humor. People were laughing in the courtroom, like this just doesn't happen in normal court. I recall that one of the court reporters came up to me after the hearing in Garden River and said that they'd never seen anything like that in their 20 years as a court reporter. That respect and the different way that we treated the witnesses and the elder witnesses. She said in all of her years, it was a real honor to see that a trial could be conducted in this way. So have a look at Elder Stevens.
Do you affirm that you understand the Anishinaabe language and the English language, that you shall accurately interpret the affirmation to the witness and all questions put to the witness and her answers thereto, and all such matters and things as shall be required of you to the best of your skill and understanding?
Yes.
Thank you.
Do you remember when your dad was chief, him talking to you about the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850 and the governments?
Yes. He said, let's give us our inherent right to the I forget what they call that.
Did your
my
dad?
dad. Yeah, my dad. That's what he said. That we should get our inherent right of 1850.
Did he talk to you about the annuities? The money that they got for the 1850 treaty? Did he talk to you about that?
What's that?
The Jonia?
Yeah? Oh, I don't know. I didn't. That's all he always said. He always said that, you know, it's about time they should be giving us our rights, 1850. That's a long time for us to be used, because it was just treaty time. What are we going to do with $4? We can't buy nothing with $4. And so they tried, him and Pete, but the government wouldn't listen to them.
And how did he write letters to the government about that $4 not being enough?
Yeah.
Did you see him writing letters? Can you share with the court whether you saw your dad writing letters?
No. But my dad always turned to the treaty book all the time. It says in the treaty book, he says, that we don't have to go buy a license and hunt, trap. But even then, my dad had to buy a license after they changed that at Sault Ste. Marie. they put that Sault Ste. Marie. After that, my dad had to buy a license. And they said, this year place, that old name that we used to use, it's gone. Now today, it's Sault Ste. Marie. And you have, and if you want to hunt trap, you have to buy a license. And that treaty book there, it's not any more good, they told him. It's no good. Well, the Queen's picture is on it, that don't matter, he said. So that's when my dad had to buy a license then. When it was Sault Ste. Marie, not Boating. Because that was the Indian name that they used, the Indians, Boating. From the 18th century.
Did your dad, when he was chief, complain that the $4 was not enough to the government?
No.
Did you see him complaining to the government that the $4 was not enough?
Pardon?
At Treaty Day?
The treaty, yeah, that's what he talked about all the time. He always brought out the treaty book. He said, that's what the Queen gave us, he says, was the treaty book. Now it's about time they get rid of the Indian Act. And that judge says never. So I don't know how we're going to make out. We'll try to get rid of the Indian Act, or even change that $4. I don't know how we're going to make out, unless one thing that I can think of, stop those trains. Stop those trains. I see a train going by, freight. There, I counted 9 cars, all loaded up with logs. So every day like that, they're taking away our wood. So so if they can stop the trains, put a teepee there, because that teepee is spirit. There's a spirit in that, because it came from the wood. All the wood, the trees, it's all spirit. The Indians always believed that. My dad believed in it. And today, I believe in it. Anyway.
We're all done, Irene.
All done.
You were done.
Oh, yeah. See, miigwech, I say that 100 times, miigwech. Yeah. Yeah. Every one of you, miigwech, for having me here. I was very glad to come here and be with you. Try and help. I'm trying. Dear, I'm 95 years old. I'm still going.
Elder Irene Stevens, let me add my thanks to you from the court. Miigwech to you, Elder Stevens. I echo all of what you have heard today. We are all very privileged to have you come to this hearing and to speak to us. Miigwech.
Miigwech.
Okay,
Thank you.
we're done. We can walk you over.
So I must say, to this day, Elder Stevens continues to guide me in the work that we do, and everyone. And I think you've heard from Chief Sayers talking about how inspirational she has been to all of us. We could not do this case without the Anishinaabe perspective. You will hear from chiefs, elders in stage 3 of the trial as well. I remember when we first started this case, and we started first in ceremony. We have followed Anishinaabe protocols from day one, and I remember the late Joe Arve telling us that he thought that this case could be won without the Anishinaabe perspective, that we could just win it based on the common law principles. But our elders, told us right from the get-go, you cannot talk about this treaty without the Anishinaabe perspective. It has to be done. Don't be afraid. Our people are ready. And so, for my part, it is an honor and a privilege to work with the chiefs, knowledge keepers, elders, experts, and communities in bringing that perspective to the Annuities case and to the court and throughout every aspect of this case. We even had some of our ceremonies recognized at the Court of Appeal, which was for the first time. Chief Justice Strathy and Justice Lowers were very open to make sure that our protocols were respected. In practicing our ceremonies, from day one, the Crown officials and the court experienced firsthand that we still very much live our customs, traditions, and practices, our Anishinaabe laws. Elder Stevens is in the spirit world now. She left us on July 2nd, 2022, at 99 years of age. But if you listen to her testimony, she just talked about how she just always wanted to help. But she's still one of our helpers now in the spirit world. I know I think about her always. I want to end my presentation today on the Anishinaabe perspective and how vital it is to interpreting any treaty. I want to end with a snippet from my closing submissions at the trial about the importance of the Anishinaabe perspective. You will hear someone coughing all throughout. You probably heard it when Chief Dean Sayers was introducing her, and you will hear someone coughing throughout my closing submissions. And I feel like it was Elder Stevens encouraging and reminding me to keep going in a good way. I remember the last thing she said to me, the last time I was able to talk to her, and she was having to leave the building, and she turned around, she was always so comedic, and she said, "I'll see you later." And I really believe that to be true. I will see her in the spirit world one day, and I'm really happy that I got to share this time with you today in Treaty Week. And I look forward to working with you at the Supreme Court of Canada, the trial. Hopefully we settle this case someday, and that Ontario really does honor Treaty Week by now recognizing and honoring our treaty, not by ignoring our perspective, the Anishinaabe perspective. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy this little piece from the trial. And again, I encourage you, all of this is archived. If you have time to watch it, it's your evidence, it's your story. Miigwech, Bamapi.
I will never be as great as Dr. Stark in some of the other stories, and that's why I'm going to read. I'm going to try and tell this story, but it resonates with me. It's the treaty with the Beaver Nation. So in this story, This is about our treaty with the Beaver Nation and this young girl, this young Anishinaabe who goes out to fast, which we still do. So she's actually engaged in her puberty rite ceremony in that fasting. In the longer version of this story, they talk about her charcoal on her forehead, and she's gone out fasting to seek her purpose in life, and they really explain the fast. And while she's out there, she's approached by this man. And in the words of Dr. Stark, they hit it off. And you know, then he asked her to marry him. They live, and then she lives with him. Things are moving quickly in this story for this purpose, I admit. And she admits that it was a quick romance, if you will. They marry and they're living together, and they come to have a number of children together. And she's living a very comfortable life, a very happy life. And you know, she talks about being really well off, and that they have many gifts and goods. And they're without want or desire that they may have so many things. And she notices that her husband and children will often leave. They'll come back with many gifts. And they're always very happy. So she asks them one day, "Where do you go? And why do you leave me at home?" And her husband says, "We go to visit with the Anishinaabe. We love visiting with the Anishinaabe. They always show us such love and kindness and give us these gifts." And she says, "Well, I want to go visit the Anishinaabe too, with you." He says, "No, you should stay here." And they leave it at that. And her husband and the children go off to visit the Anishinaabe. And one day she's cleaning up around the house, and she looks around and realizes that she's in a beaver lodge. And she's bewildered and wondering, how is it that I'm in a beaver lodge? What's happening? So her husband and children return, and she confronts him with this new realization that she's in a beaver lodge. And now I think that Elder Irene Stevens has joined us. I know that she would say if she was in the beaver lodge, she would take that beaver and skin it. She could probably skin one today.
I think there's a long list. She could skin.
So her husband and children return, and she confronts him with this new realization that she's in a beaver lodge. And she realizes that she has married a beaver. But again, he's saying to her, he knows he's getting up there in age, and in the time he will pass on to the spirit world. And so he says to her, "You know, when our time together is complete, I want you to go back to your people and tell them about how much we love the Anishinaabe and respect the Anishinaabe, and how much we enjoy visiting with them." So he does pass on to the spirit world, and she does return to her people, and she tells them all about her time living with the beavers. And she says to people, "You know, beware. Like, you must show respect and love to the beaver, for those who respect the beaver will find great success in trapping. But if you don't have respect for the beaver, you won't have success." So if we look to this story, and this is in the words of Dr. Stark, and her interpreting this story, it's about the relationships. And one of the relationships is the young girl with the beaver nation. We can see that this is really a treaty between the Anishinaabe and the beaver, where Anishinaabe, there are these very core principles for the Anishinaabe that are driving the relationship. The first principle is respect. So, and respect here is also embodied in the notion of love. That we must respect and love for one another, to act in kindness. And again, with great reverence and respect for one another. And we see this with the women kind of giving the instruction to the Anishinaabe, when she returns, that they must be respectful when they engage in trapping practices. And when they talk about the beaver, they must do so with great respect. Then we also see the sacred principle that's really important in this story, which is the principle of responsibility that we sometimes will talk about through a language of reciprocity. So within, somebody give Corbiere Stevens enough. So within that story, you know, she talks about all this comfort that they're living in, and every time her husband and children return from the Anishinaabe, they bring back gifts. And so we see that principle of responsibility to one another being enacted in this story, because it's through that offering of sama, that tobacco, that Anishinaabe make when they first go out to trap a beaver or any animal or any bee. And they petition that beaver to come visit them, if you will. That they're asking for the best beaver to give their life, or not the best beaver, that beaver to give their life for the Anishinaabe, to then also be able to live in the same kinds of comfort and to thrive, much as we see the beaver nation thriving in this story. And a protocol that Anishinaabe have when trapping beavers, and it's a little different for every animal. But with beavers, we're told, they return the bones of the beaver back to the water after we've used the other parts of the beaver in a respectful way. And so the act of returning bones back to the water, we see the story through the ways in which the father and children continue to return after they visit the Anishinaabe. And this is the third principle of renewal, where this isn't a one-time thing. It's not a one-time agreement. It's a relationship between the beaver and the Anishinaabe that's ongoing, living relationship in which every time Anishinaabe are trapping, they have to offer their sama, that tobacco, again and again. And this is an ongoing process. But also that treaty it remains intact and ongoing by the return of those bones back in the water. So the Anishinaabe and the beaver both continue to enjoy kind of a mutual benefit from their relationship through this enactment of their ongoing relationship. So again, this treaty is rooted in these principles of respect. Respect for one another, showing love and kindness to one another. It's driven by a notion or principle of responsibility to one another, and it's understood as ongoing and is always in need of renewal. So this is what enables the beavers to be born again and again and regenerated. So what we say is that from these stories that Dr. Stark showed, and all of the stories were interrelated, and they're a source of our law. Like Dr. John Borlaug says, you have to know how all of the stories relate to one another. Elder Kelly talked about the different ways of learning and the particular importance of Hansapanen, as did Elder Rita Corbiere. They're sacred stories, and storytelling can be very sacred. Dr. Stark explained that stories are an embodiment of how we have lived with creation since our very existence, including living on, and the importance of living on Anishinaabe and King. She explained the stories as a source of law, but also embedded with them as a legal philosophy or jurisprudence of Anishinaabe law and its interconnection with our relationship with creation. What this specific story teaches us is Robinson-Huron treaties are intended to strengthen relationships and kinships. The notion of trust embedded in this story, beavers are trusting the Anishinaabe to carry out their obligations and responsibilities that enables their regeneration. So we live in a deeply interconnected world here in Canada, and we must rely on one another to be able to thrive. Again, to summarize the three core principles driving this treaty relationship: respect, responsibility, and renewal. The importance of our mutual responsibilities, the necessity of upholding and implementing these fundamental principles through specific practices and protocols. For example, returning bones to the water. When I talk about the Treaty Council and interpreting the treaty through Anishinaabe law and applying Anishinaabe law.